In 1928, the first winner for Outstanding Motion Picture was Wings. In a few minutes, we'll know the 50th. The films nominated for the Academy Award this year are Annie Hall, Jack Rollins, Charles H. Jaffe Productions, United Artists, Charles H. Jaffe producer. The Goodbye Girl, Ray Stark production, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Warner Brothers, Ray Stark producer. Julia, a 20th Century Fox production, 20th Century Fox, Richard Roth producer. Star Wars, a 20th Century Fox production, 20th Century Fox, Gary Kurtz producer. The Turning Point, Hera Productions, 20th Century Fox, Herbert Ross and Arthur Lawrence producers. And the winner is Annie Hall, Charles H. Jaffe.
Reconsideration.
It's the fourth episode of For Your Reconsideration. 1977 has arrived. Yay! Apologies to Kermit and the Muppets. I get excited. I'm Matti Price, and along with producer Jamie J.D. Dew, we are back with a great panel. I'm your host for the conversation once again. Will we need a do-over, or did the Oscars get it right? This episode looks at the mostly American movies of 1977, including Best Picture winner Annie Hall, dance drama The Turning Point, unreliable memoir Julia, star vehicle The Goodbye Girl, and an obscure film now lost to history, Star Wars. As always, our panelists will present their own alternative ballot and winner. Thanks again for listening and downloading. As always, this podcast is available pretty much wherever podcasts are available. And you can learn more about this and other great shows at Dewvre.com. That's DEWVRE.com. Join me, panelists Karen Gordon, Ryan McNeil, and Leslie Byron Pitt. This discussion was recorded over the interwebs and feels like it happened only yesterday, actually, instead of 1 or 2 weeks ago. So let's get into it. Okay, this is 1977. I am Matti Price. I'm joined by an amazing panel. I'm going to go around and give everybody a chance to introduce themselves. Karen, why don't you start? Let the folks know who you are.
Hi, Matti. Thanks. And hello, everybody. My name is Karen Gordon. I'm located in Toronto, and I'm a freelancer. One of the things I do is work as a film writer and film critic. I'm a longtime film fan, so it's really an exciting thing to me to be able to do this. I've done film criticism writing on a whole bunch of mediums, TV, on the CBC, on radio, but I'm also one of the founding critics of a website called originalsin.ca, and that's mostly what I'm doing now.
Nice, thanks. And thank you for doing this.
My pleasure.
On a personal note, Karen Gordon, you are my favorite, maybe one of my top 5 favorite all-time CBC radio hosts.
Thank you.
And I'm so happy that I got to know you. Really and truly.
Thank you. I was always freelance, never full-time there, so maybe I should send this to them.
The first time I met you, I was scared to go up to you. That's how much I think you're great.
Wow.
I like everybody on the show, but I just needed to say that. I needed to level set on Karen. Leslie, please introduce yourself from across the pond, as it were.
Yeah, so my name's Leslie. I am a film writer, podcaster, and photographer, allegedly, all those things in England. And I've been kind of freelancing and writing movies for more than I would like to say. Mostly blogging, but just I find myself in places like Set the Tape. I've written for Empire. I've contributed to BBC iPlayer and Sight and Sound and Jazz FM and all over the place.
And thank you so much. Again, this is such a thrill to meet you in person. I know you through a website called Row 3, which is now defunct.
Yes.
But boy, it's been a pleasure knowing you all these years and to get to talk to you in person. Amazing.
Guys.
Oh, me too. Last and absolutely not least, because of course I am the worst person here. Ryan. Welcome.
I'm Ryan McNeil. I'm in Toronto, Canada. I feel like I'm the one at the kids' table in this little coffee clutch that we've assembled. My podcast is the matinee.ca. You can find it anywhere the podcasts are found. We talk about film from the point of view of passion and perspective, and arrive fortnightly. Used to write a lot more than I do now. Maybe one day I'll try it again, but these days I live behind my microphone and inside of my own headphones, and I'm very, very happy to be here.
Yes, this is super exciting. This is a great year. I'm really happy to dig into it with you guys. Just to level set, the Best Picture nominees for this year of 1977, which was presented in 78, the winner was Annie Hall, a little tiny film that nobody had heard of called Star Wars, The Goodbye Girl, Julia, and The Turning Point. So one thing I like to do to start this off is just to level set with everybody and sort of get a sense of your perspective. What is, in a way, what I'm curious about is, what is your relationship to this year in movies? Like, how did you generally encounter these films? And this year in filmmaking, were you alive? You may not have been. For instance, I was 6 in 1977. Here's what I remember. I remember other 6-year-old kids in my class bragging in September about how many times that summer they had seen Star Wars. I've seen it 4 times. I've seen it 5 times. And I remember thinking that was dumb. I very distinctly remember thinking, what? 5 times? That's just dumb. And I was wrong. I did not see any of those other nominated films that year. I didn't see any of them till much later. The Goodbye Girl and Annie Hall, I probably saw in early high school, grade 9 or 10, something like that. And then I watched Julia and The Turning Point much more recently. And I think that may be the same for you guys, but I'm curious, what is your, what were you like in 1977? Were you a thing? And if, whether you were or not, how did you kind of come at these movies?
Who wants to go first?
Anyway.
Well, I don't know if I'm the youngest, so I wasn't around in 1977. So how I got to these films were, I obviously had seen 2 of the nominees already in my teenage years. And I do mean my teenage years. I saw Annie Hall and Star Wars when I was in my teens. I didn't watch Star Wars when I was younger. And that one decision has kind of really dictated how I view movies. I think so many people watch Star Wars and they're in love with it, and I am at times indifferent to it, and fans have not made it easier. But the year of 1977 for me, I just went back and looked at some of the lists of these movies, and you forget how stacked some of these years of film are. And I just had a look, and there was a list of films that I had that I thought was just a little bit more interesting at times. I mean, you got Saturday Night Live, you got Eraserhead, and you got Close Encounters, Sorcerer, Looking for Mr. Goodbar, and Free Women. And I'm like, wow, this is interesting, the nominations they picked up, because I would have changed at least 3 of them.
We're going to hold that thought. We're going to get there. Ryan, were you alive?
Not quite. I was conceived. Way to go, Mom and Dad.
So you, as my parents would say, you did not have a window seat.
I did not have a window seat. No.
Yeah.
I mean, Star Wars is one of the earliest films I can remember seeing as a boy. I'm a little bit more into it than Leslie is, but not as into it as some. And so I can understand the angst, for lack of a better word, as I got into classic film. In my early 20s, I would have come across Annie Hall, and then more recently, The Goodbye Girl and Julia. The Turning Point was the only film that I had never seen before, being approached for this show. So that was the new introduction, and I find this to be a really fascinating little cross section. Even more fascinating when you mention some of those films that Leslie talked about that are on the outside looking in. But this is a really, really interesting group of films.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm dying to sort of get into it. I will give Karen. Karen, I apologize for in any way referencing your age, but my suspicion is you did see some of these.
Yeah, I'm really terrified to talk. I considered hanging up. Not only was I alive in 1977, but I was already into my 20s. I'd already had a job and moved to another city. I was living in Ottawa in 1977 and was already, it's funny, at that point in my life, I didn't think of movies as anything but the thing I did on the weekend. And so I had, when I started writing about movies and thought back to which movies, Annie Hall for me changed the game, by the way. It was a huge moment for me. Yeah. And Star Wars was a novelty, a wonderful novelty, but it wasn't for me. I know I've talked to so many people who are younger and who weren't maybe born then, or who were 6 or 5 or something. I know who's become a major figure here. Star Wars just riveted him at the age of 4 or 5. He knew then he wanted to work in movies. But I saw all of them. When I think back at movies that profoundly affected me, it would have started with maybe The Godfather. But I grew up going to the movies on the weekend. It was a whole era where if you wanted to see a movie, you went to the theater. So the movie that I saw 3 times at the theater was Annie Hall. So I kind of have maybe a little bit more of the sort of sociological context of some of these films, because the 70s, I think, is such an underrated era in movies. It was considered in some ways trashy because you ended up with, at that point I was really into music. I worked in radio, I was a newscaster. I did I still have my scripts for some of my little movie reviews at the time, which is pretty funny. But So I understand maybe a little bit more from an experiential point of view as opposed to from a film history point of view, why some of those films might have been in that category.
When you saw Annie Hall, did you drag different people to see it? Unfortunately, he's now deceased, but my best friend at the time, who I met when I moved to Ottawa and became he was like my brother from another mother, Howard and I went. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. And I have a lot of things to say about it, so I could talk about it for a long time. But effectively, I'm kind of Woody Allen. And so I'm that kind of personality. And it was the first time I saw people talk, when you talk about representation and what that means, it's really, that movie really for me says a lot about it. It was really interesting to see somebody that neurotic and that I was kind of funny and I was fast so it was like looking in the mirror. And then I loved New York. I loved the idea of New York. I always grew up with this fascination for New York. So that era, New York was going through a rough time. And Alan encapsulated and captured so much in that movie. So I did not have to drag anyone. Howard and I went back 3 times in a row because he was also kind of Woody Allen, a more balanced human being. But yeah, I was definitely I should have been relating to some of the female characters maybe, but that sort of neurotic, and it also was kind of the times, it did speak to the times in more than just my life. And I'm really curious. So I didn't come at Annie Hall as a person at the time because I was 6, and I think I probably would have been lost on me a little bit. I have Marshall McLuhan right here. I don't think a 6-year-old would have understood what that meant, really. But I do come at it from the sort of cultural specificity of being Jewish and it having this very strong kind of Jewish cultural impact of
me too.
On me, right? And I am really curious. I don't think I have no compunction about understanding why it won Best Picture, but we can talk about it more and why you guys think it won or didn't win. But I do think it's interesting. Like, what is, Leslie, what was your reaction to it when you saw Annie Hall?
Well, I remember watching Annie Hall first years ago. I think I was probably about 16, and to kind of add to what Karen was saying, I think there is something about the representation of it. In terms of, there's a universality of it, or just there's something about the way he encapsulates that neurosis of being being a person trying to get into dates and everything, and being that kind of the odd person, even in somewhere like New York, and having this kind of talent but not sure about this talent, and all these little things about it, about him as a person. And I really latched onto that, because that's what Alan was really good at doing, and that's why in all his movies there is a Woody Allen type character in there. It's just his way. But going back and watching it again this week, what really kind of solidified things to me was the filmmaking itself. And it's quite interesting. It's quite funny that I think people talk a lot about like the Spielberg oneer, so the one camera take where he just has a one camera shot, and it's actually just holding the camera at a certain point, and people kind of block and talk around it. And there's this amazing moment in Annie Hall where like the characters talking aren't even in the frame, and they're having this back and forth conversation, and they kind of slowly warp into frame. But it's also Gordon Willis cinematography composed in such a way that you've got a leading line up to them as well, so you can't see them at first, and then they kind of come in, and it's such a simple looking thing in terms of like how do you do that type moment. But one of the things I found is like when I look at especially a lot of modern kind of rom-coms or comedies or anything else like that, I was like, no one's putting that much effort into something so simple. No one's putting effort into those kind of little conversations. And apart from maybe, and this is going to be a bit weird, but like I really liked Olivia Wilde's Booksmart, because I thought that had one of the most well-directed sequences in something like that, and maybe something like Game Night as well. But watching Annie Hall, what I loved about it is he was just breaking the mold from scene to scene while also investigating his own neurosis. And for someone like myself who was writing about movies at the time at 16 and whatnot, I was like, man, I really want to make films. This is really interesting. It was just his ability to use form to navigate his personal aspects were the things that really kind of I wouldn't say shook me to the core, but I was just flabbergasted by how he made it look effortless and easy.
I find that so interesting because people rarely, if ever, talk about the filmmaking itself. In Woody Allen, they talk a lot about the characters and the writing, and you're right. There is a lot of formal invention, and not just the stuff around, I think, talking directly to the audience, which obviously had been done in different ways many times, but was done very uniquely here. But you're right. There's an awful lot of visual ideation going on in how he chooses to sort of expose his ideas, right? To actually like work them through. And that
it's
thing
cut so well. Like
yeah.
It's the thing that I realized is like it's a comedy, so the timing has to be on point, and it is cut so well, so leanly, and so I don't feel that you need to have overt backstory to all these characters because it's already in there, and you seem to know so much about these people the moment you meet them, and that is something quite interesting to see from someone. He just seemed to capture those personalities well, and I don't know if those were the personalities of New York at the time, but I mean, a lot of the writing used to say, well, look at what he's doing with these kind of slightly upper class individuals in New York, and you could only wonder if you like how good he was, how well and how accurately he was putting this together on screen. There's just something about it.
Ryan, is that sort of your takeaway as well, or do you sort of come out and bring other things out, draw other things out of the experience?
I think my experience with it is that it's a film that that moves the form. Like when I was younger, certainly before I came to it, my taste in comedies were things like, Dumb and Dumber or Crocodile Dundee, or like silly slapdash, big, broad, make money, silly comedies. And just like any other art form, any one thing can be many things, which I think is why the Academy stood behind it in the face of something much bigger and broader in the way of Star Wars. It was a comedy that basically said comedy can be something else. Like comedy can be a lot more cerebral. It can be a lot drier. It doesn't have to be slapstick. It doesn't have to be screwball. It doesn't have to necessarily appeal to all audiences. That doesn't make it any less genius. You can see the influences of this touchstone picture when you watch films by Greta Gerwig and Noah Baumbach, and I think it's quite apropos that they were together, considering their taste, obviously. I think it's saying something that, aside from the artist, it's the last picture to win, the last comedy to win Best Picture, and the artist gets a big lift by playing with the silent form. Like, you can say that the artist is using that as a gimmick, and that's how it ends up being the next comedy to win Best Picture. So that was my thing. Was actually the first time I watched it at age 19, 20. I didn't get everything, it was just more my sense of humor at the time. But like Leslie said, like I certainly appreciated the filmmaking was spectacular. Like Karen said, like seeing, a story of people who weren't in my immediate community and weren't, it made things far more interesting. And that is everything happening inside of the box. There is a broader conversation outside of the box if we are reconsidering 1977. But inside of the box, that is certainly my relationship with Annie Hall.
And look, oh, sorry, Karen.
I'm just going to say Joaquin Trier, who did The Worst Person, is the director of The Worst Person in the World and other films. This site also cited Alan as a filmmaker. Alan hasn't, I can't remember if he's talked about this. I'm sure this isn't my own thought, but I think he's very inspired by the French New Wave when it comes to the style of filmmaking. He'd made a few films before Annie Hall, obviously, and I didn't realize he'd been a theater director. He'd written a lot for TV, but I think that he probably came of age watching those French New Wave movies in New York. And a lot of that, I've gone back to them because he's a huge influence on me. And as I started to get more serious about film, looked at stuff, and that business of people talking off screen, some of his moves are, to me, quite inspired by that. And I love the way they work and change American comedy.
Oh, he did do Fast. If you remember, he did do Fast with Bananas early on, like his first movie.
Yes.
And this was the one where people kind of turned around and went, oh, he could actually be serious.
Yeah.
So he did 3 farces in a row, because he very broad. He did one that took off on revolutionary politics, which was Bananas. Then he did one that took off on science fiction with Sleeper. And then he did Love and Death, which is essentially like a parody of Russian literature and epic movies. And I think the thing that's, to me, the thing that like at the time would have sort of shocked people into realizing kind of the depths of this guy was the fact that he had done these movies and they had pigeonholed him. They decided he was a kind of a Mel Brooksy director. He was a guy that was going to take on genres. Maybe they were a little more elevated genres than Mel Brooks was taking on, but he wasn't going to turn around and do this. And, to be frank, it is astonishing to see the growth between those movies and this. The one thing that I don't think really gets talked about a lot that I think is really key to maybe, like, for me, what makes Annie Hall special or lasting or influential in a way is Alan's background as a stand-up.
Yes.
He might be the best pure joke writer to ever do it. If you go back and listen to Woody Allen stand-up comedian, that is banger after banger.
And quick.
Quick and incredible setups. And the thing about Annie Hall is that it captures, Karen, you mentioned the neurotic quality, but I think what it really captures is his stand-up persona of this sort of, neurotic person, and translates it into a story that is super compelling. And in my opinion, like, we can talk about a lot of the films, like Worst Person in the World and a lot of other films that I think benefited from Annie Hall. But frankly, I'm not sure without Annie Hall that there's ever going to be a Seinfeld.
No. Definitely not.
Like how would that happen? How would, those scenes with him and Tony Roberts just kind of walking down the street and Roberts keeps calling him that nickname and stuff.
Max.
It's like, that's Max. That's Seinfeld.
Kind
That
of.
is, to me, that's where a lot of that sensibility comes from, where you go, I'm a stand-up and I have this thing. Now I'm going to turn it into a show, like a dramatic form, right?
Sorry, I'm interrupting, but the thing
No,
also
you're not.
about that movie, when you look at the other nominees and then even go larger to see what was missed, but when you look at one of the reasons that movie might have been compelling beyond all of the sophistication, the quality of it, like it wasn't a toss-off thing, is that it really did capture the times. It captured a certain point in feminism. It captured like Annie Hall was this kind of conflicted character between old and new. Like I'm a little younger than Annie Hall would have been, but certainly we're that generation of women that was raised to be one thing, and then suddenly you had all this freedom. There was the youth culture coming in. It was also Hollywood was changing, and it had already started in the early 70s, but it was changing again. So what you had was New York was decaying. It was a mess. There was racism, all this other stuff that he touches on in the movie. So I think that when you compare it to some of the other nominees there, and you compare it to Star Wars, which now with Legacy may look different, in that year, you couldn't have asked for a movie that seemed to encapsulate so much of the culture.
It's fascinating to me that Goodbye Girl was nominated the same year, because it's a very much in my opinion, well, we can talk about it, but I feel like it suffers by comparison.
Oh, very much so. It's not that it's a bad film. It's just that
it is not at all. It's very charming, but
it looks like a sitcom just next to it. And I think if I remember in production notes, I think they were trying to make it a sitcom, and it shows. Not in I try not to say it in a kind of negative way, but I'm just thinking of like The Odd Couple and things like that. And
does the Goodbye Girl feel like the real New York?
Not at
the
all.
way that Annie Hall feels like the real New York.
I mean, it feels like a play. That's the thing. Like it's not a fluke that Neil Simon wrote it. Like it plays like a play, and it feels like a play. Like it's got those lines that are really, really catchy in that very Billy Wilder, I.L. Diamond kind of way that really, really crackle on a screen. But where, films like Annie Hall and some of the others that we talked about even before that didn't even make the class felt more like they were cut from people sitting around and shooting the shit. This felt very, very but very, very rote.
He rewrote it. He rewrote it in 6 weeks. Like he originally had made it about something different. He was married to Marsha Mason, so she was the lead in it. Originally cast Robert De Niro in it, and it wasn't working. So he didn't. None of it was set in L.A. So
I want to see that version.
He said De Niro is not that De Niro is not funny. It's that De Niro is funny in a different way, and of course Neil Simon's, as you said. But I wonder if you took Richard Dreyfuss out of that movie. I mean, to me, with no disrespect to any of the other people, Marsha Mason was okay in it. She was good in it. The little girl, Quinn Cummings, was good in it. But to me, that movie rests on the performance by Richard Dreyfuss. It's so charming.
It's a tour de force. Yeah. There is, let me tell you this. There is no point in my entire marriage where my wife has not hung up her bra and I have not said, I don't like the panties hanging on the line. And I pull like that thing from the bathroom. I just have it in my head constantly. It's just so funny the way he says it. And a fun sort of like weird fact, but the sort of the comic set piece of that movie is this horrendous production of Richard III that he gets himself into.
Yeah.
And the character that Nicole Williamson plays, the sort of maniacal director, is based 100% on Mike Nichols.
Oh,
yeah. So I guess Neil Simon had like a somewhat bad experience with Mike Nichols on a show, and like this was his revenge. I don't know.
I think that role was played by Paul Benedict.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right.
The director, which is even funnier. He was hilarious in that.
He's got one of those voices that even if you don't remember his name or his face, it's like, oh, it's that guy. He speaks that way in everything.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
thank you for the correction.
No, it's okay. I just thought he was, to me, that's the point where I thought this guy's so good. He so manipulates that poor actor that played by Richard Dreyfuss, and who's so humiliated by what he's being asked to do.
Do you guys think that, like you said, I think it's inseparable to pull that Richard Dreyfuss performance out. Do you think that this was a case of them, the Academy, just kind of liking Richard Dreyfuss so much and having seen him come so far with Jaws and other stuff that they were sort of caught up in it and wanted to put the movie in there?
I think it's Neil Simon. I think it was the Oscars has a habit of honoring legacy artists. Like I didn't like The Fabelmans. I know some people did. It's like Spielberg got nominated for The Fabelmans, which was not his strongest work to me. And I think Neil Simon is, he was a superstar at that point.
Yeah. Okay.
That's just my feeling.
It's
Does
also,
anybody...
I mean, it's also,
Yeah, go ahead.
it's also the era. This is still when Hollywood is really very, very still kind of linked with Broadway. We're not that far removed from when a lot of the big musical productions were dominating, nominations and even wins, very, very deep into the 60s and early 70s. So
if you had a successful play, they made it into a movie.
They made it into
Almost
a movie,
always,
and
right?
everybody remembered the play, especially if it happens to be a Neil Simon play. So it's kind of, while on the one hand, it is definitely propelled by Richard Dreyfuss, and if you put anybody else in that, it does not work as well. It automatically gets that lift from being a Neil Simon play, from being a very successful Neil Simon play, just because that was kind of the nature of things at the time.
It does feel like a play. I mean, it doesn't really move that far out from anywhere. Like, one thing about Annie Hall is at one point you do go to LA and it's never stuck in one place. You're all over New York.
Yeah, you get out into the city a lot.
Yeah, and then with this, it's obviously, considering what the film is about, it's quite claustrophobic anyway. But you don't really leave that house, and it shows. It really does show in that movie.
There are a lot of movies about New York City, obviously, but there are two that I think capture the geography of New York City perfectly. One of them is Annie Hall, and the other one is Die Hard 3. And
you don't hear those mentioned together very often.
Both films, you could put, like, when he takes a car trip from one place to another, you're like, yep, that's exactly how I would drive that trip. Yes, this is exactly correct. I do. Now, a lot of years, I think, all 5 nominees are movies that people still cherish, they still talk about, they're still kind of top of mind. Not so much this year. I would say, fairly or not, 1977 has 2 film nominees that I think if you ask the average, even the average, sort of enthusiastic film goer, I don't know how many people have heard of Julia or The Turning Point. Really, truly. And so, I watched both of those films a couple of years ago, and I will be the first to admit they made very little impression on me. You guys have maybe seen them more recently. What are your sort of thoughts around? So just to put this in perspective, I think The Turning Point had like 8 or 9 nominations. It got 0 wins. It did not win anything. And Julia had like almost the same amount, and it I think got 1 win for Jason Robards, which he pretty much took away from Alec Guinness. And say what you want about Star Wars, I cannot believe that they didn't give Alec Guinness. But. So, like, what do you guys want to talk about those 2 films maybe together a little bit? Because or should we separate them out?
I will go to bat for The Turning Point, because that film, that's the only one of these I had never seen before. And, if people could see the group chat for this episode, that was the hardest one for a lot of us to source.
So much
online.
Yeah, that film was amazing. I loved the holy heck out of that film.
Oh, really?
I watched, my wife and I watched it together, and she was like, she as a Broadway nerd and a dance enthusiast was like, why have I never heard of this or seen this before? Because holy shit. You see influences of All About Eve in this movie. You can see how it would affect something like Black Swan in this movie.
Yes.
The dancing in this movie is just glorious, and they take long time. You have to like dance. I will admit that openly. If you do not like dance, you're in for a long 2 hours. But if you enjoy seeing dance on film, this is a film where
I like dance and Baryshnikov.
Yeah. Now we're really getting into qualifiers. Yeah. But you will hear. I don't agree with this, but you will hear a common complaint nowadays that when dance is captured on film, that the editing does not allow it to just play as well as it could play. Like it feels a need to to intercut and to really, energize it when maybe it doesn't need it. Again, I don't agree with that, but you'll hear that a lot. This is the opposite of that. There are a lot of long shots where, first of all, you just watch Baryshnikov do what Baryshnikov does, and it's just stunning to see. But the filmmaking captures the dance in a magnificent way. And then, as if that isn't a treat enough, you watch Kat Ross and why did Miss Kubelik's name just drop right out of my head? Shirley MacLaine have this simmering, long-standing rivalry, which just plays to the point where they're getting into a cat fight in Lincoln Center out in the courtyard, and I'm like, this is cinema. This was the delight of my homework for this episode. I love this movie so much.
I'm so gutted. Like I get gutted sometimes when you hear someone talk so passionately about something, and I just thought it was so slight.
No.
I was really frustrated. The dance is beautiful. The dance is absolutely beautiful. And as a Philistine, I only know Baryshnikov from Sex and the City. So sorry. But I just found myself just watching this and really wanting more tension, really wanting more out of it. And I just felt so much of it was so slight. I thought Tom Skerritt was in there, then he wasn't anymore. And structurally, I got frustrated. And by the time it got to the end, where you're talking about the cat fight, I kind of burst into laughter as opposed to, and then they burst into laughter, and I was like, okay, well, fine, okay. But I wanted more. I wanted more fieriness from it. I can see why, like, I think you hit the nail on the head. You can see elements of something like Black Swan in this. But what I like about Black Swan is it is trashy and it is outrageous, and I needed more, something like that in there.
It's more stretched out and theatrical and extreme in its operatic kind of qualities, right? Karen, at the time, do you remember seeing?
Oh yeah, I think what's interesting, but it's really interesting to talk about, is I haven't seen Turning Point. It's very hard to get, and it's interesting too that it and Julie aren't, because they are films that starred women, right? We all talk about where are women of a certain age. So the thing about Julia at the time is, first of all, it was Baryshnikov's first, I just looked it up again, double checked. It was his first movie role, and he was a huge star then, and of course you couldn't have access to him unless you were in New York. So this was a big thing. I mean, he'd done one or two things on TV, I think. But it was the thing about the Turning Point for me was that it's about women in the era, and you're juggling this changeover between career or family. Can you have both? What does it mean? And there is a little bit of that, a lot of that cliche of this, that women are never friends. Like there's always a competition. So I think it attempts to resolve that in a reasonable way. It's so culturally, that's where it sat for me. Is you had you had stars in it, Anne Bancroft and Shirley MacLaine. You had this incredible dancer, Baryshnikov, and I think the woman dancing with him, I'm sort of just blanked on her name, was a principal dancer as well.
She was, yes.
At the new, so you had a pedigree. It was Herbert Roth. Like everything about it was pedigree, but at the same time, it wasn't groundbreaking. It wasn't, when we look at the films that ended up being groundbreaking, it wasn't really groundbreaking, and it was attempting to be all things to all people in some ways. That doesn't diminish the fact that it was a good movie.
No, yeah. I will turn around and say it's got some amazing. This is going to sound really damning with faint praise, but it's got some amazing blocking in there. And
that's not faint praise. That's really hard to do. Because
it's one of those things where you realise how good, like, the craft of the film is in terms of looking at the blocking and looking at having a crowded table and all these people around it. And then making sure that the one, like, if you want one person to feel more diminished, you place them there. If you want one person to feel more empowered in the conversation, you place them there. And the way that the characters move around it's that kind of secret sauce of what makes filmmaking better for certain movies and whatnot. And I think Anne Bancroft is really good as well. And Shirley MacLaine is always pretty good.
Yeah. And I should clarify, it didn't leave a huge impression on me, but I certainly don't think it was bad. Like at all. It's terrific. I think it is, somebody mentioned, I think Ryan, you mentioned All About Eve.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good, I'm pretty sure the Barbra Streisand remake of A Star Is Born was like the previous year, right? And I think there was maybe like a bit of what can we do to look back on some of these older forms in filmmaking, especially, the 70s. They sort of blew the door off the rules. There were a lot of movies that did not play by traditional rules and had become very successful. And I think, there was maybe a sense of like, let's try to go back and pull some things forward and make them feel modern and make them feel relevant again. And this is probably a good example of that. I just think there's, I agree that I think a big part of why this movie doesn't survive and why it's very hard to get a hold of is because it has female leads, and there's no reason the Turning Point shouldn't be in every DVD anniversary collection of that studio, and something that is brought back and held up as a great example of a movie from the 70s. It sucks that it's not.
Well, then again, when if you take a look at, there are women's movies like Alice, TCM the other day did I think it was Scorsese's birthday or De Niro's somebody's birthday, and so Alice doesn't live here anymore as often. Like we see that as a elevator, but maybe we need to have Herbert Ross retrospectives. Yeah. I mean, some of that I think has to do with the director. And what was interesting, Ryan, while you were talking about the dance. Think about 1977 and the difference in what people expected to see at the movies and the attention span. So you could let movies run that. You could let a dance scene go that long because our attention spans weren't jagged. Yeah. And I think that's really I've never thought about that before in that way, but I think that's a really interesting thing. Or Leslie, when you're talking about like the blocking, you could do it then. You could hold people's attention. People wanted to be entertained, but I think that, that it is, maybe it's time to do a retrospective on Ross. And I mean, he was, again, you're dealing with a time where you've got this young Hollywood pushing against the grain. I mean, Star Wars was young Hollywood. It was meant to be a lark, not the beginning of a franchise. And you got a guy like Herbert Ross, who I think came from TV even. I mean, so you have these legacy guys dealing with Hollywood as the changeover, and so this was kind of an attempt to be groovier, maybe. I'd have to research that, but it strikes me as sort of a compromise.
I mean, or at least to like get in front of new audiences.
Yeah, the interesting thing about Ross is, I mean, he's a director he's got 2 pictures out of these 5, which is really hard to do. He didn't get best director for both, but one director getting 2 pictures into the class does not happen very often. So, I mean, well done, Herbert. But it's also this thing that, as you go back through Oscar history, or even just through Hollywood history, you see this thing where directors are a brand for a decade. And then all of a sudden, they're really not. A case in point with this is somebody like, and I say this as somebody who loves his work, is Barry Levinson. Barry Levinson, like Oscar award-winning director. Barry Levinson, if you went to the average film student right now and said, talk to me about the films of Barry Levinson, they'd probably respond with, wait, which one was he? They recognize the name, but they can't necessarily put the two together. I think in 5 or 10 years, you're going to hear that same response with Tom Hooper, but that's a whole other show. And that's the thing is Herbert Ross in the 70s.
You're not going to hear it about Tom Hooper because no one's going to ask about him. All right.
Oscar award-winning director, Tom Hooper. That's the thing. People would be doing a show like this and be like, wait, which one was he? So, yeah, it's very much what Karen was saying, that, like, when you're looking at, we all do retrospectives of Scorsese, and we do retrospectives of Agnes Varda, and we do retrospectives of pick the director, but you don't hear about retrospectives of people like Herbert Ross, despite the fact that their work is, by all measures, really, really quite good.
Yeah, there is certainly a bias against what I would call artful invisibility, which happens a lot in these really good films, which is that the director doesn't necessarily put
they're not showy,
style on it, but they're just, camera's always in the right place at the right time for the right amount of time. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What about Julia? Should we? How much time do we want to devote to?
I want to award it the best supporting performance by a hat.
It was a bit of a slog. I found it a bit.
It's just a strange movie, right?
Well, looking back at the history of what it's about and realizing that the controversy about it was Julia it's based on a so-called true story, but Julia herself may or may not have existed, and it was kind of debunked that she did. I found it really, really hard. Once I had that knowledge in there, I found it really, really hard to kind of sit with the story, especially with the fact that from the tagline and everything, it's all about friendship, and there isn't that many scenes where the film builds upon this friendship. And I kind of just struggled with that. It just seemed to be... I mean, it's difficult because I said at the beginning of this that I would replace 3 movies, and Turning Point and Julia were definitely one of them. And there's something about what Karen says about representation and women's movies, and I'm there really struggling with these 2 movies, and I was wondering if there was anything I kind of just missed, and maybe it's just I was coming from it from a different point of view or anything, and I just think it was just structurally I just found them just hard to get into. There's elements of the craft that I think are really good, and I think performances are really good. I think Jane Fonda is really good, but I'm watching that and I'm thinking, oh, well, I like Jane Fonda in Clue. I don't like her in this. There's just so many. There were just so many times where I just found myself kind of drifting off. There didn't seem to be that much to say. I was like, oh, is that Dashiell Hammett? Oh, great. And that was about it. Like, there wasn't much to it for me. Like, although I do like Jason Robards, he's, you know.
I mean, I think there is a great movie to be made about the relationship between Lillian Hellman and Dashiell Hammett. I'm not sure this is it.
But it's not really about them, is it?
Right.
It kind of has him there to say, look who it is. And when she first says Dash, I was like, Dad? No. Oh, it's Dad. And then I was like, oh, right, okay. And then you're like, oh, this is an interesting thing. And for me, a film like this I would want to, after watching it, get really involved into looking at the history, looking at those relationships, because I wasn't there at the time. And this film doesn't do that for me.
Again, to me, representation, it's great to see women's films, but they have to be good. I mean, there is that. Like, you know, representation isn't, you know, it's an important thing. And I think movies should be allowed to fail. Like, you should be able to have a director with a vision, and they make that vision, and maybe it doesn't work. Like, to me, you don't have art unless you have failure. It's ridiculous. Otherwise, everybody's making just basic standard schlock. I'm not schlock, but it gets to be schlocky if everybody's doing it. So,
the question
this to me was an attempt to be portentous. Yeah, like it was, and there were more reasons that Vanessa Redgrave's casting. Oh no, was it Vanessa Redgrave?
Yep,
indeed.
I think there were more. I think it was controversial, but I think they had these 2 incredible actresses, and they wanted to do something with them, and so that has its own, you know, that's its own form of hell. It has to still be a good movie. It's great to see women's movie stars with women. It's great to see the industry taking them seriously. But by 1976 and 77, both of them were well respected. So that's likely
let's just say,
why it did what it did.
Is the failure on the part of the film, or is the failure on the part of the Academy to think that they needed to elevate this movie into a Best Picture nominee?
Definitely on the part of the Academy.
It seems like a weird choice, right? We talked about dancing in movies. I just want to quickly go through some of the movies that maybe certainly could have been on this list and didn't. And I really want to start with Saturday Night Fever, because it is mind blowing to me that was not on the list of nominees. That's a movie that I feel like absolutely hit a cultural moment in an insane way in 1977. Like, I'm not sure there was a bigger, even Star Wars, I don't think was a bigger cultural moment in that year than Saturday Night Fever. Like,
because Fever gets the extra boost with the music. That's the thing, is that it you know, bounces over into a whole other art form and captures a moment in that art form while capturing a moment in film as well. Yeah. So it's like, but it also double prizes.
And the music hides the toughness. The music hides the toughness of that movie. Yeah. I remember never really getting into Saturday Night Fever until I actually sat down and watched it. I was like, oh, wow, what am I watching? Yeah. I was kind of shocked by the, again, like some of the racism involved and some of the mood
misogyny.
Of it. Definitely a misogyny. And you're sitting there and you're like, wow. And it's just a really, really tough film. And I just recently watched Officer and a Gentleman. And it's the same thing. It's just this element where all the little things that kind of made it into the mimification of it and turned them into these kind of pop culture, like, tabletops or counterparts or something.
Yeah. And like, I don't think it's equally important necessarily, but, you know, Saturday Night Fever and also Looking for Mr. Goodbar the same year, you know, they're not celebrating women, but they're certainly looking at the reality, or trying to look at the reality of what's going on with women and what they're facing.
Well, I would have put Goodbar and Free Women in place of Julia and The Turning Point. And I think there is much more complicated and complexity there in those films than I see in something like Julia, which, I don't know, it seemed like it wanted to be an espionage film, and I don't know, I didn't get much out of it. It just felt like a bit of a slog.
What other hidden gems or like overlooked movies do you guys think we should be thinking about?
Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Oh yes, that's right.
Hidden gem.
Hidden gem.
The film that I in many ways I wish could have got the love that Star Wars got. To the point where even those two directors made a bet amongst themselves over which one was going to do better. And like each betting on the other, saying, no, yours is going to be the better one. No, yours is going to be the better one. And George lost. That film, if I actually had like a time machine and could go back, that would be my by door number 3 between the Star Wars and Annie Hall divide, is I would just go through the Close Encounters door.
Karen, is there anything that you feel like we didn't get to, or that should be on that list?
And not without going back and looking at in that era when I was going to see movies, I was terrified of going to see something foreign. I was convinced I wouldn't get it. That was the year of Eraserhead, which I took years to watch. I actually watched it on video when that finally happened, and was like,
I mean, look,
I had no idea what I was watching. Like,
I think it's also a movie like Eraserhead feels like it needs to come out of the discussion only because almost no one actually saw it in the year it came out. Like, it's a movie that played midnight screenings and sort of slowly over time became well known, but it's not really a movie that got released.
Would it make like a grand?
Like, it didn't get put in movie theaters the way we would think of a movie, you know. So it's like, it's not really. I'm not sure it's fair to, like. I love Eraserhead, but it's like I don't think there's a way that movie would have been even talked about in 1977.
People were talking about it, but it's a kind of quiet hum. It scared me enough to wait. I mean, there are some interesting movies in that year that I haven't seen. The Duelists. I mean, that you hear. So there are some ones. I think Saturday Night Fever. I've never actually contemplated that before, quite in this context. But I think in that era, again, it was processed as a music film, as a film about dancing and about this character Tony Manero. It wasn't. I don't know that we had.
Yeah, it's funny.
Was a distance.
It is a film that has music in it, but like, I can't think of a movie that's more about it's sociology.
Yeah,
that movie. It's an examination of something that's going on, and that, you know, the fact that it's based on this rather famous magazine article, and that it's really, like, I think very effectively looking at like an experience in a way that's really authentic.
And again, New York in a very difficult era, you know, about class and about attempting to, you know, what disco. Disco's fun, but it was also a place everybody went and got really dressed up. So you're coming out of the era of down, you know, hippies and all of this stuff where everybody was wearing this, everybody looked the same, and then suddenly this culture is shifting over, and I don't know that there. It would be interesting to try and think about whether people were sort of ready for what was going on there.
And then there's a movie that opened the same week as Star Wars, and I think in any other or in most other years would have been a movie that people were talking about, and that's Sorcerer.
Oh yeah.
I think Sorcerer holds up pretty amazingly well. Considering it is a remake, I think it is, maybe that hurt it at the time. I think people thought you can't put a remake into contention, but then A Star Is Born was in contention the previous year, so I'm not totally sure.
And then New Star Is Born has been in contention in its year.
Right, and like
West Side Story, you know,
right. So other than the fact that I think people maybe my guess is that people were not really big fans of Friedkin, and they were kind of tired of him because he was a bit of an enfant terrible in the community and like hard to work with and stuff. And so maybe they were like, screw him. But like, it's a pretty spectacular movie. I'm blown away that it gets no nominations. Not even.
But
like,
it was a flop, wasn't it? Like it was
a huge flop.
A huge flop.
Yeah, it opened the same day as Star Wars.
And I think he had a lot riding on it at the time. Yeah, I think I think he had a lot riding on it at the time, and I think it did knock him for 6 slightly. And I'm always gutted because I had a chance. I met Friedkin, and instead of saying anything about Sorcerer, I just kind of babbled because I was like, "Wow, I've just met William Friedkin."
Something we talk about on my show though is that we need to remember that when it comes to Oscars, that it is a game, and some studios are just really a lot better at playing it. You can see this right now with a studio like Searchlight, that's just basically dominated nominations for at least 10 years. I think they're clicking towards 15 years now. And at the time, if a studio just did not want to push a film for nominations, they didn't want the win, they didn't want any extra money thrown at it because it does cost, that was just the end of it. Like, this stuff, it seems terrible to say it, but this stuff just does not happen organically. It takes a studio to want to do it, sometimes out of pride, sometimes out of wanting to elevate an artist for work well done. But whichever studio was behind Sorcerer, if they didn't want to, enter it into what they thought was a crowded field with Star Wars already there, after having already taken its lumps at the box office, then that was game.
Yeah. Are there any movies that people consider to be blind spots for this year? Movies that you really think you ought to have seen from 1977 and just have not gotten around to it?
I mean, Sorcerer. Sorry, I was quiet through that for a very good reason.
No. You are in for such a treat. Oh my God, it's so great. I'm so jealous.
It would be The Duelist for me as well.
Duelist is great. Yeah, that's a. I did see that a few years ago. I haven't seen Cross of Iron, which is the Sam Peckinpah movie from that year, and Fun with Dick and Jane, which is
that one's good.
Seagull.
That's a good movie. That's a good movie.
Yeah, that's that year.
And it got remade as well, didn't it?
Yeah, with Jim Carrey.
Yeah, but I think the remake has no plot points in common.
No,
like I think it is a remake technically, but like the whole story's changed, right? So I don't know. I would like to see it. I did see George Segal recently in Roller Coaster, and I highly recommend. I thought Roller Coaster was going to be really terrible. It's actually pretty good. So I'm going to go. Oh, sorry.
I wish I could remember A Bridge Too Far. I know I've seen it, but I think that might be another. I can't. Sometimes in that era, right? Like in any era, you stuff a movie with stars, and sometimes their demands on their role can kill it. I mean, I wonder. That's what I wonder about Julia. Whether you have these two people saying, "Yeah, we'll do this movie, but this is how I want to."
You're totally right, though. We didn't talk about A Bridge Too Far, and it's a massive World War II film with it's one of those 900 well-known people in the cast movies.
Yeah, and a good director.
Did not get in there. I think coming off of films like Patton and The Longest Day and like a bunch of other, like maybe it just is there's some fatigue around World War II movies and maybe because of Vietnam people.
Oh, definitely because of Vietnam. Like we're right at that. We're right at the turn of war film. Like the next year you're going to get Coming Home. The year after you're going to get Apocalypse Now. So the fatigue for the World War II films was very much front and center.
Yes. This year did have a movie where with a very conflicted Vietnam vet. Unfortunately, that vet was played by Henry Winkler. It was called Heroes. But it was the number 10 movie at the box office in 1977.
He was shell-shocked Mundo.
Yeah, he was. Him and Sally Field. Very strange. And it was a huge hit, apparently. Yeah. Okay, it just totally hits the spirit. So let's go around the room and talk about what would we actually have on our ballot. I will participate in this, but I'll go last. Let's go in reverse order. Ryan, what would your ballot look like for 1977 if you had to redo it now?
So cast a vote for the winner or my 5?
Your 5. Let's start there.
5. Okay. I would.
What would you keep And what would you throw?
I would keep Star Wars and The Turning Point. Knowing what I know, knowing what I know now, I would lose Annie Hall. I would lose The Good Boy Girl for its own merit, and I would lose Julia. I would replace those three with Three Women. With I would replace it with Searching for Mr. Goodbar and Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Okay. Leslie, what would you keep and what would you throw? You've talked about it a little bit, but let's formalize it here.
So yeah, I would keep Annie Hall. I would keep Star Wars just because. Even though I said a week ago I just bin the whole franchise. But I'd keep that, and then I would go with Sorcerer. And I would go with, I did note this down, it was Sorcerer, Looking for Mr. Goodbar, and Three Women. Those are the ones I would go with.
Karen, what would you keep?
I would keep Annie Hall. I would keep Star Wars.
And what would you add back in?
Well, that is a question. I think that I would have to spend a bit more time rewatching things because I didn't see the Free Women film. Is it Three Women or Free Women?
Three Women.
Robert Altman.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sissy Spacek, post Badlands, pre Carrie. Shelley Duvall doing her twee Shelley Duvallist. All out in this, like, out in the middle of nowhere.
A sanatorium, right?
Yeah, it's sanatorium in this, like, kind of backwoods Texas area where there's just, like, you know, like a Melrose Place type apartment complex. I'm so excited about this movie. I'm smacking my own mic.
Is it 1977 though? Is that the year? I don't see it on any of my lists.
Unless
it should be.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think we're right. I think it's 77. Yeah.
I'll believe you guys.
Yeah. Well, I would also only keep Annie Hall and Star Wars, I think. And I think it's unfortunate because there's some good movies in there, but yeah, I think the other three do not quite make the cut. I think Saturday Night Fever has to be on that list, Close Encounters. And then I think the fifth one, it's a toss-up between Looking for Mr. Goodbar and Sorcerer, but I think I would pick Sorcerer. And that would be my fifth. The real question is, did they make the right choice with Annie Hall, or do we need a do-over? I know Karen thinks we do not. I'm going to just go out on a limb here and say you believe they made the right choice. Am I correct?
Yes, of this group, yeah, because in that era again, Star Wars was not considered. Well, I mean, it was really respected and loved, and it had huge box office, and it was fun, and it was a game changer. But if you look at what Annie Hall did, it was more refined. It was more culturally. I just think that it was an important film. I think it represented a change in comedies and rom-coms. I think that it was beautifully made, and I think it kind of hit a cultural nerve.
This is a really fun debate and discussion because I think what we're getting down to is what is, on a weird level, what's more important, the hero's journey or observational comedy? And that is as tough a choice as you are likely to have, sir.
But you know the thing about sorry, Leslie. The thing about the Oscar awards is that people can teach you how to understand a movie, how to make a movie. But there's no course on how to choose an Oscar winner. Right? There's no choice on how to compare apples and oranges. So,
totally.
So, I mean, because it's the distance of history, it's possible to say that this is the film that seems to have. Not every year do you get a film that grabs the zeitgeist like this.
Well,
so that's why it's easy for me to say. That's why I'm so definitive. Usually I'm floundering all over the place.
No. And not to put pressure on this conversation, but we are in touch with the Academy, and whatever we decide here is going to be what stands. So I just... Leslie, would you change it?
Yeah, so I feel that I would give Star Wars Best Picture, even though I know what I've said all this episode. I would give Star Wars Best Picture.
Yeah.
and I would give Best Director to Woody Allen.
Okay.
I think Annie Hall's a better directed movie. Watching the two recently, looking at them, I was like, I now realize why they do have Best Director, Best Picture. I get the feeling that in terms of the success that it came out of it and moving stuff forward, Star Wars is the one that gets it. And obviously, I've got hindsight with this, but in terms of how the movie is made and what they're doing, I think it's quite interesting. And directorial choices, I think it would go to Woody Allen. That's how I'd do it. I'd split it that way.
Ryan, would you do this over?
I absolutely would do this over.
Yes, you are the one person who threw Annie Hall out of your ballot.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry. I would give Best Picture to Star Wars. It changed a lot of things. Some for better, some for worse. It's fascinating that in many ways it's a complete antithesis to Annie Hall in the way that Annie Hall is such a singular vision, where Star Wars is really a film where that it took a village. Like, that is not George Lucas's, vision entirely. It is the editors helping him. It is, God knows, it is the composer helping him. It is the production designers helping him. It is everybody making that thing work, because if it was just George doing what George wanted to do, it would not work nearly that well. But the fact that the village came together in that way, I would celebrate the village. And, to go with Leslie's extension of this and say, I would also then split off director, but I would split director over into Steven Spielberg for Close Encounters, because he is directing his ass off in that movie and making it look so simple.
Okay.
Close Encounters is, now that I didn't give my other list, but it is, just want to endorse that.
Stamp.
Yeah, it's a narrow thing. I love this discussion. I think we have collectively decided that amazingly Star Wars does win out as our choice for Best Picture.
Not collectively.
Not collectively. Yeah. Not unanimously.
I can never forgive that last scene. Sorry.
Of Star Wars?
It was hokey then. It's hokey now. Sorry. Go on.
Not a big fan of handing out medals.
No, I think no. You're mad because they don't give one to Chewbacca. I know. I understand why you're angry. That is some Chewbacca erasure. He flew the damn plane. All right. Look, this has been incredibly fun, and what a great year to look at, and what a stark contrast in nominees. So I couldn't have enjoyed this more, guys. Thank you so much, all of you, for participating. Let's go back through the order again in reverse, and we'll just talk about where we can find your work online. Ryan, where can people seek you out and find out more of the wonderful things that you do?
People can find me at thematinee.ca. My show is on pretty much anywhere you can find a podcast. It's there. I went looking the other day for new platforms. I was like, oh, I already happen to be there. How about that? So yeah, my show drops fortnightly. We talk about a lot of smaller movies, but we, dip over into blockbusters now and then. And thank you very much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Leslie, where can we find your work online? Including, by the way, you put it down yourself earlier, but you are a hell of a photographer, man. Please plug your photography.
I'm going through I'm going through imposter syndrome at the moment, so please don't. So it's easy to find me on Instagram and Twitter at AfroFilmViewer. At the moment, I'm usually writing on Set the Tape. I can also be found at the erotic thriller podcast Fatal Attractions. I'm there a lot. I think we're 98 episodes in now, and I'm trying to get my hiatus podcast Hustlers of Culture back when I can, which was unfortunately due to tragedy is just not with us at this moment in time, but we'll see what's going on with that.
Well, thank you very much. Karen, where can we find you online and enjoy more of your thoughts and ideas?
I'm part of the team at Original is that a dash? Sin? Not a lower dash, the one in the middle. Originalsin.ca. And that's my most frequent when I do a few other things. That's the best place. And this was fun.
So much.
Thank you so much for having me. I love meeting all of you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, we will be back with another episode looking at the following year, 1978. In the meantime, be well. The theater is closed. Let yourselves out, and don't forget your coats. 1977 is done and dusted. With a mixed response, but ultimately no do-over. Thanks again to Ryan, Leslie, and Karen. We'll be back with another episode soon for your reconsideration.
For Your Reconsideration is a production of Douvre Podcasts and Such. To subscribe, share, rate, and review, please visit douvre.com. Douvre Podcasts and Such.